Imagination and withdrawal. How do you get ideas? What are you doing when your best ideas come to you? Most people find that their best ideas don't come when they're thinking about the problem that they're trying to solve, or when they're trying to come up with a new song lyric or an idea to solve a technical problem. What commonly happens is we grapple with the problem or our creative effort with our intellect, and then when we go away and rest the mind, maybe go to sleep, then the solution pops up by itself, apparently. What's really happened is that the deeper part of the mind has been working on it while we're sleeping, and it incubates and then comes up with a solution. The imagination isn't something that we can normally control consciously. We have to allow it to do its own work, and then it'll give us what we need. And we need to be in a receptive state. So a lot of people seeking inspiration will go into a peaceful place where they're free of the cares of the world, hopefully, and then their imagination can flow freely. Beethoven was famous for going walking in the forest, and that's where he found that the music came up from within him, and then he would come home and write it down. Dylan Thomas, the great Welsh poet, would often wake up in the early hours of the morning with poetry flowing through his mind and ask his wife to write it down. Probably didn't do wonders for his marriage, but it did produce some beautiful poetry. So for most people, we sort of intuitively understand that to get inspiration, we need to find a peaceful place. The great poetic work on Walden Pond was, of course, the result of sitting by the pond for a year, in fact, and writing this beautiful piece of poetry. So these are the natural ways that we can tap into our inspiration and let our imagination bear its fruits. But there's also, on the part of a lot of musicians particularly, I have to say, and some other artists, there are uses of a kind of artificial means. So some people turn to drugs to alter their state of mind, feeling that it helps them to tap into their imagination more easily and readily, and it's kind of on tap. You just take a pill and suddenly there you are in some altered state that seems to be very creative. The downside of this, of course, is that often it's delusional, it's not really very good, and of course drugs are not something I would recommend to anybody unless you really, really need them for some sound medical reason. So there's a kind of an artificial way of doing this, but it has its dangers. The good news is that as an alternative to medication, you have meditation. There are certain techniques of meditation that have been shown, even in tests, to help us to tap into our imagination and make us more creative. There's a study from Leiden University in Holland where they demonstrated this through an objective process, and they concluded that, yes, certain methods or techniques of meditation can help to make us more creative. So how can we really free ourselves of the burdens of the world, of anxiety and the things that disturb our minds and make it difficult for us to go into this peaceful state? Because in theory it shouldn't be necessary to go out to walk in nature in a peaceful place in order to feel peaceful. The peaceful feeling comes from inside of us, so why can't we just tap into it, when we're at home? What we, again, sort of intuitively but incorrectly often think is that by getting the things we want, we'll find peace or we'll be happy. But the problem is that we desire something and we get it, and then another desire comes up, and desires are actually endless. That is not the route to eternal happiness. Ask any wealthy person. They've got all the material things that they wanted, and usually they're not necessarily any happier than anybody else because they still have the cravings and the aversions. Inner peace and the ability to really let go of our worries about the world comes from letting go of the desires themselves. If we're free of desire, then we're free. We're free of anxiety, we're free of fear, of loss, we're free of craving. To give you an idea of the power of this, I read an amazing story by Eric Clapton, the great guitarist who was made famous in his band with Cream. Now, he has had a very extraordinary life. He was so famous when he was 19 years old that there were people, writing on the subway walls in New York that Clapton is God. Now imagine what that does to the mind of a 19-year-old, super talented young man. He is also a very sensitive person, and he became very disturbed, and he fell into drug use, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and he became a serious addict of heroin and alcohol. And when he was touring with the band Cream, and like one of the biggest bands in history, he said this was the most miserable period of his life. He's world famous, he's a brilliant musician, everybody thinks he's wonderful, and he's incredibly miserable. He struggled with these addictions for years, and finally he writes in his autobiography, and he admitted himself to a clinic, particularly to deal with alcohol. He had already kicked heroin by this stage, but he was really determined to get rid of this because it was destroying him. So he went into this clinic, and he was there for 2 months. And he went through the program, and the psychologists were helping him, and he, by the end of the program, felt great. I'm free of this. I can be okay. I can live a normal life. And he came out, and his life was good. And this continued for quite a while, about 1.5 years, I think it was. But then he made a mistake. He got overconfident, and he thought he could take a drink. And he's an alcoholic. He fell back into this self-destructive pattern almost immediately, and sure enough, soon he was back where he had been before he even went through the treatment. Struggled with that for a long time, and then eventually readmitted himself to the same clinic through the same program. And this time everything went well. He was performing well. The psychologists were satisfied. They felt like he was overcoming his problem, but he knew that he was just gaming the system. And he knew how to, make out that he was, going to behave himself and able to control himself. But in his heart, he knew he hadn't beaten it. And he was getting desperate because this was the only way he knew how to overcome this terrible addiction that was destroying him from within. Came to the end of the program, and he was in despair. Everybody thought he was fine, but he couldn't kid himself. And he really described this very beautifully. He's a great writer. That this was the moment of sort of darkest moment for him. And in that moment, he thought about God. I mean, he had some idea of God or of a creator or a supreme being, but he wasn't particularly religious, but he had this feeling that there is some greater power. And he thought, if anyone's going to help me, this is my moment when I need help from the divine. And he fell on his knees and really surrendered in his heart to the will of the creator of the universe. And he said in that moment, he lost the desire for alcohol forever. This letting go and really allowing ourselves to be free of our attachments and clinging onto the world, which allows us to go inward and find peace, this is known as surrender. And it's a surrender really of the ego and of the clinging on, letting our hands be open so that we're not clutching onto the things that cause us, in the long run, pain. And the method for doing this internally in the yoga tradition is known as pratyahara. That's a Sanskrit word that means sense withdrawal, or withdrawing your mind from the world. So when you sit and meditate and you do this practice, effectively what you're doing is a kind of internalized version of going for a walk in the forest. That's a simplification of it, but it is like that. It can be a visualization where you're letting the world, that's the world that bothers you, the world where you're engaged all the time, letting go of it and redirecting your attention inwards and using your concentration and your imagination to take you on this inner journey to a place of peace within you. And that stimulates imagination.